Hello, 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 and welcome back to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. If you are new to the podcast, I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wilson. In our last episode, we discussed how stress sabotages learning. And if you missed that episode, I encourage you to go back and take a listen. Today, we're diving into a related topic that is, again, timely and essential: how racial and cultural stress impacts mental health and identity development in teens and young adults. Joining me is Dr. Ryan DeLapp, a clinical psychologist and the author of a newly released workbook, Empower Yourself Against Racial and Cultural Stress. In his work, Dr. DeLapp doesn't just talk about the psychological toll of racism. He offers a framework for healing and empowerment rooted in his REACH program, which stands for Racial, Ethnic, and Cultural Healing. Whether you're a parent, educator, clinician, or a young person yourself, this conversation will shed light on how we can support youth in not only recognizing racial and cultural stress, but in reclaiming their agency, self-worth, and sense of belonging. Join me in welcoming Dr. DeLapp to the podcast.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Dr. DeLapp. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Like I was saying before we hit record, I'm so glad that Lucy connected us and I got to learn a lot about the work that you're doing. And so again, I'm so grateful for you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah. You wrote an actionable and I would say compassionate book, Empower Yourself Against Racial and Cultural Stress, which is an important and essential, I feel, resource, especially for teens and young adults navigating racial identity and the emotional weight of cultural stress. So I'm excited to jump into this conversation with you. But what motivated you to write this book specifically?
Yeah, so it was really a response to the times. I was working in a population in the Bronx, New York with teens and young adults, particularly medical students and PhD students. And we were all wrestling with stuff going on in 2020 as it pertains to those conversations around race and its role in our country. And I noticed at that point in time that though I had done a lot of research, I had really struggled to translate some of that into the conversations I was having clinically. And that's what led me to start thinking carefully about how to translate that work into my appointments. And that became the beginning of REACH, or this program, this workbook, and so forth.
And I can completely see that. And I see that intersectionality, that cultural stress piece and racial piece for a lot of students we work with. And I work with students who struggle with learning, processing information, mental health challenges, but also are struggling with the things you talk about in your book, that cultural stress and that racial stress. I'd love for you to walk us through what REACH stands for. You just referenced it.
Yes.
And then we can talk about how it helps young people cope.
Absolutely. No, it's a term entitled Racial, Ethnic, and Cultural Healing. I was intentional about wanting to come up with a term. It's actually a term that my wife helped me come up with. And I was, struck by just how inclusive the experience of cultural stress was. There are many youth and even adults struggle with this sense of feeling judged or mistreated or questioning why I didn't get certain opportunities or why I don't have certain forms of support. And sometimes that questioning falls on this idea of maybe it has something to do with myself, with who I am or how the world perceives who I am. And I really wanted to make sure that folks felt like the REACH program that I've developed in this workbook has an inclusive message that people can come to it and see if they can get something from that.
Right. And I'd love to talk about kind of how the work that you do and the workbook actually helps young people cope with racial and cultural stress, because I think there's an awareness piece. They know something is happening, something's going on, something feels off and something feels even unfair, but they may not know how to cope with it and have those tools and strategies for being able to navigate those environments.
Yeah, so coping is, I think, broken down into many components. And you touched on one important one, which is awareness. And I think within many families, that's a part of the learning process that parents and caregivers take their children through, which is often referred to as ethnic racial socialization, which is helping young people learn kind of what it means to be themselves. And a part of that learning, unfortunately, in our country is sometimes how racism or different forms of cultural stress can impact the lives of young people. And so a part of the book's first step is helping young people see just examples of how this can look in the world for other people so that they can start having those examples as a way to kind of process their own experience against that. And then the next step is really just understanding kind of how do these experiences have an impact? And then from there, I want to help people to understand that these different impacts can lead to different needs. And those different needs is kind of how the book is divided up so that folks can come to this resource, get what they need, and maybe come back a little bit later because maybe the next time, unfortunately, they experience something like a racial or cultural stress, they may need a different set of tools to kind of navigate that experience. And so that's really the diversity and the flexibility of this book is intentional to meet the moment that people are in.
Right. And meet people, young people where they are, because, again, that important piece in the beginning that you talked about is, that identification, and then also the awareness of who you are as a person and all of the factors that go into making you who you are. And for many young people, they may not recognize the stress for what it is. And you talk about 3 types of stress, which I think is really important because we've talked about stress on this podcast before, but you talk about emotional, agency, and identity stress. Can you briefly kind of describe those and why it's important to name and even differentiate them?
Absolutely. I mean, when 2 people walk into a room and unfortunately experience something like racial or cultural stress, those 2 individuals can walk away from that experience with 2 different reasons why that impacted their life. And so the 3 stresses you just mentioned, emotional, agency, and identity stresses, are 3 ways that I try to help young people to ask that question of how it's affected their life. So emotional stress is exactly what it kind of sounds like. You walk away feeling like maybe physically uncomfortable, your heart rate's beating pretty fast, you're really tense. It's the stress signs within the body. And then the emotions aspect of it. Maybe the emotions are very intense or overwhelming and hard to manage. And so I really wanted to have a whole section of the book devoted to just really navigating the emotional experience. Agency stress is a little different in that, yes, these stressful experiences can be emotionally harmful, but they can also make you wrestle with what can I do about having some sort of control over my environment? Do I feel like I can change or pursue the change that I want to see? And if not, how is that affecting me knowing that I want something to be different or safer for me, but I don't know how or feel like I can do that? So I wanted to have a whole section of the book that helps people to walk through that deliberation and that impact. And then the third one is just acknowledging that when you are exposed to racism, it has different messages attached to it in terms of who you are, how the world maybe makes assumptions about you. And I wanted to kind of help young people to be critical about the messages they're receiving and have tools to protect themselves from the messages that are inaccurate and not helpful to their building self-love.
Yeah, and I think that the distinguishing between those 3 types of stress is so important because, young people can be navigating any of those different stressors at any given time. There's overlap between them, and it also gives us some guidance in terms of where individuals need support, right? If the stress is largely related to identity stress, is it more emotional and manifesting as anxiety and sadness and, lack of motivation and those kinds of things? it's so important because, you know, one of the things you talked about earlier in our conversation was the internalizing of that, right? The internalizing of those stressors and what that and how that shows up in young people's lives. And I think that's really important too, because sometimes it manifests as disengagement or, you know, behavioral issues or, you know, withdrawal, sadness, anxiety, and we may not recognize it for what it is. And if we don't recognize it, we don't know how to support.
That is, that is actually a really important point because, you know, when working in clinics with kids, you know, and even their families, they rarely come in with complaints related to racial and cultural stress. They rarely come in saying, hey, Dr. DeLapp, you know, I'm really struggling with this like racially insensitive thing somebody said to me. But what I do see is the complaints, like maybe even it's like school refusal, right? Maybe it's, you know, and oftentimes we're taught to look at school refusal through the lens of maybe the child is socially anxious or they are, you know, behaviorally kind of non-compliant. But, you know, have we asked the question of, you know, does this child feel safe? Does this child feel like they have a sense of connection and belonging? And do they feel like they are respected and embraced within this space? Do they feel like they have allies or advocates within this space? And one of the things I've learned is by taking this like culturally informed lens, it sometimes does highlight some stuff that gets missed and how we may need to help young people advocate for an environment that is more supportive of them because, you know, they've experienced some racial and culturally stressful things in that space. So that's one example of how I feel like this book can be used to kind of capture what's missed sometimes by us as clinicians or even us as educators or the adults in the lives of young people, is looking at, you know, the core essence of the emotions that someone's going through, instead of just getting lost in like what's adaptive and maladaptive about what they're doing in that moment in time.
Right. And there's always this tendency to kind of compartmentalize and say, oh, this child is acting this way because of, you know, this issue, whether it's struggles with friends or, you know, struggles with the coursework. And there are different stressors as well. But there's again, this overlap. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both at the same time. And one can exacerbate the other. You know, I've had conversations with probably 3 different families over the last couple of months about stereotype threat in individuals who are struggling with learning when they have learning challenges. And then they're also experiencing the stereotype threat because they feel like they're confirming the biases in society when they struggle with math or reading or writing. And that's such an important, you know, thing to be able to see, identify, and then address that level of stress that is not the same for other students.
And I think with your work and you even bringing that up with the families, and hopefully with a resource like this book, it gives people the power to name components of their experience so that they're able to have a little bit more compassion as to why they are going through what they're going through. And even the adults in the lives of kids can have more compassion and empathy towards what the young people are going through. And that's, you know, one of the things why I was very intentional about the selection of language here is because I wanted there to be this sense of like really stepping into uncomfortable discussions and being able to walk away feeling like, yes, I learned something about myself. I learned something about why I react or respond in this way. And it actually gives me information that I can use to talk to my parents or my teachers or others in my life, my clinician, to say this also was a part of my experience too. So I think whenever you're able to help families name these things, it can help them to kind of clarify what they can do to cope and heal from them as well.
Yes, and what you're speaking about is that advocacy piece. You know, when you're giving students the language to explain or describe their experiences, that is so helpful, and it's also validating for them, right? And it helps them to kind of understand what it is that they've been struggling with and might be contributing to some of the behaviors that others are seeing. And it helps, again, really helps with the language. You also write about empowered coping. Can you talk about that, what that means?
Yes. There's, I love to shout out the people in this field who have inspired this work. And so the 2 folks that I'll name right now are Doctors Rihanna Anderson and Howard Stevenson. And they came out with a paper a couple of years ago where they talk about the recast model. And the recast model is, as I've understood it from their writings, is really helping us to understand this concept of racial coping self-efficacy, which is kind of what are the mechanisms in the life of young people that helps them to feel like they have a sense of efficacy or knowledge of what to do whenever they are faced with different manifestations of discrimination or racial and cultural stress. And so what I try to do is take that concept and break it into more manageable steps for young people. And so when I think about somebody who feels efficacious in navigating something, well, one is they're able to put their experience into words. And so the first step of empower coping is clarifying how I've been impacted by my environment, right? So a young person is able to come to their parents, their clinician, or even to themselves and say, the thing that person said to me, it hurt my feelings, or it makes me, the way I responded to that made me feel as if I didn't know what to say, or I didn't know how to respond, or what they said to me is actually hard. It's like I'm ruminating about it. I'm thinking about it a lot in my mind, and I really can't shake it. I can't escape that thought. And so the first part of this empower coping is really helping young people to name it. The second part is then once they name it and they are acquainted with the different ways this book talks about that they can be impacted, that they then have an I can. Okay, because I've been affected emotionally, I know these are what I can do to kind of cope with those emotions. Or I know if I am struggling with this thought about myself, I know these are ways that I can like protect myself or think carefully about this thought. And then step 3 is about implementation. You know, we can't just stop at brainstorming. We have to actually take some action or make some effort towards the healing and coping process. And so the 3 steps in summary are just clarify, name what you can do or what your options are, and try something, implement it and see how it might work for you. And that's what this book really tries to equip people with, being able to do those 3 steps.
Right. And it feels like this is also a place where parents, caregivers, educators, clinicians can provide that support, because naming it is one thing, but they can say, I can overcome this or I can deal with this, but they may not have the tools to be able to do that or know what to do in that moment or in those moments.
I think community healing has been one of the biggest examples in my life as someone who's a Black male clinician, and thinking about the ways I've navigated racial and cultural stress in my life, is being able to lean into the elders within my community or my peers and their wisdom. And so I also wanted to demonstrate that within this book as well by, I think I coined the term in the book, calling, all my navigators, my workbook navigators. And there's a lot of suggestions throughout the book to ask readers to talk to the people they trust most about the resources here, because I don't want them to only rely on the wealth of knowledge in the pages of this book, but the wealth of knowledge within the circles of support around them, so that they can, have people who have more applied understanding within their cultural communities of how to do this stuff. And it builds connections. It strengthens connections and helps people to have difficult conversations so that healing can kind of be deepened and take place. And so there's a lot of prompts throughout this book to kind of help young people to lean into those networks.
Right. And I feel like when you talk about healing, with healing, there's hope,
yes.
right?
Yes.
It feels like it's not just we see the problem, we know what it is. There's actually healing, built into this whole process. And it is a process. And we know also that when young people internalize those cultural stressors, those racial stressors, and they're not addressed, they're not identified, they're not talking about it, they don't feel that they can do anything about it, and they don't have the support to address it, it shows up later in adolescence and young adulthood. And this provides an opportunity for the support to be given to them and to empower them early so that we can reduce the chances of these issues affecting them in the future.
You make an excellent point there as well, in that, I think there's this another thing that I've noticed when it comes to young people being able to engage in this community is that there's also generational divides within how we talk about these topics. And sometimes parents will utilize their own experiences and their own kind of lens as to how they were able to rise to the occasion or navigate these spaces. And while there's a lot of wisdom in that, they may not necessarily always align with the young person's experience as well. And so a part of also community healing is teaching the folks in the community how to empathize and validate those experiences of what the young person is going through so that the young person can feel safe and feel like, oh, they get it, right? And so a part of this resource is helping to give those adults in the community the ability to kind of listen to the young person's feelings. And that's why I really start off this book also with the BEAT acronym, right? Which is this body sensations, emotions, action, urges, and thoughts. And it's helping the young people understand what their BEAT reactions are, or how they're feeling in their bodies, how they're feeling emotionally, what urges come up, what thoughts come up from these experiences. But it also gives the caregivers and the community members an opportunity to hear that as well, so that they can also really understand how deep these effects are for the young person, so that they maybe have a greater chance to speak to that and incorporate that into the types of support that they offer.
Yes. And the other thing that you do is that you share stories in your book. And for many people, I think reading those stories of other people, they can see themselves in those experiences. And maybe even caregivers can see their children and the kids in their care in those experiences. And for young people, it makes them feel like they are less alone in those experiences. And I think that is so powerful.
Yes. Storytelling is a huge part of many communities of color, right? It's sitting around the table, sitting around the living room, sitting around food, and just like sharing of stories. That's my upbringing. I've talked to a number of people who celebrate that as a strength within their community as well. And I think storytelling, as you just said, it is the sharing of ideas, the sharing of experiences. It's the calling in of people to a shared experience. And one of the things that I get the good fortune to do from time to time is to hold groups where we're able to talk about these types of topics with whether it's with teenagers or college students or just people in the community. And just hearing the power of those sharing of stories is something you can't replace. So I wanted something like that in this book. I wanted there to be 3 different characters that could demonstrate how the tools of this book can be used, but also can provide examples of how cultural stress can affect not just the life of one person. Like, it's not just about Black individuals and how cultural stress affects just the Black community, but I also wanted to demonstrate how cultural stress affects many communities of color, because that can also kind of heal some of the divides that we have within the kind of BIPOC umbrella sometimes, is to be able to see, yes, we come from different origins, but we also maybe at times have some shared experiences that we can support each other through.
Yes. And I think that's a really important thing that comes through in the book and in the stories. And again, it's the shared experience that you're talking about. It's about seeing yourself in these young people and the experiences that they're having and saying, I've experienced that as well. And then also seeing how those feelings and thoughts and experiences that are contributing to stress can be resolved. And, one of the things you talk about, and we've talked about on the podcast before, particularly with respect to social justice parenting, is the importance of belonging. And I think we can't minimize the importance of belonging and mattering. And there's so much research to indicate that it plays such a significant role in well-being for all of us. If, caregivers and educators are listening to our conversation right now and are probably ordering your book online right now, hopefully that's what they're doing, are there effective ways schools and youth programs can integrate, reach-inspired tools into what the work that they're doing? Because I think there's a tendency to pathologize some young people.
Yes.
And I think that's, we've seen that with expulsions and suspensions and not understanding the reasons behind or the factors behind some behaviors. And I just feel like with understanding, there comes an opportunity to engage and support.
Yeah, I mean, you're catching me fresh off of doing an all-day training this past Saturday for a school down in DC. So this is really fresh on my mind. I mean, my messaging to them and to all educators and parents is really what you're doing before the conversation starts with young people, right? I think, sometimes, the idea is that, oh, we have time, or when it comes to a parent, it's like, oh, I don't want to necessarily start this conversation too early. Or for educators, maybe you think that this is something that you've already touched on, or something that maybe isn't as pertinent to your student community, and then you just get caught off guard when a young person brings it up or it happens. And so, a part of the first step for me is one, thinking about how racial and cultural stress has impacted your life, regardless if you are in the BIPOC umbrella or not. Thinking about how it makes you feel to acknowledge its presence, what emotions comes up for you, what thoughts are associated with that. Because if you, when these conversations happen, it can be very emotionally intense. It can be very emotionally jarring. And so if you haven't really felt those emotions, aren't familiar with that, it can be really hard to hold space for the young person sitting across from you. So that's one thing, is, really thinking and reflecting about how this feels for you outside of your interactions with young people. Another one is, I think, I talk a lot about community consciousness, thinking about for educators, the institution or the school that you work at, and the history of that institution, and the history of the different students who study at that school, and where do their families, what is the history of those families in your neighborhoods and so forth. Have you taken time to invest in that community, to attend any festivals within that community, to learn about the strengths of that community? To learn about how the stresses related to culture manifest within that community. So that way, when a young person comes to you and shares something that is kind of vaguely related to cultural stress, your mind peaks, you have this idea of like, oh, that I see that this is a part of this conversation. So it doesn't rely solely on the young person to say directly to you, this is what I'm experiencing. So the first two things is really understanding your emotional experience related to this conversation, and really doing some education. When it comes to this book, I think the two tools I tell folks is using some of the early chapters. One is orienting young people and using like have a couple of graphics of how racial and cultural stress can manifest. So being able to be comfortable with displaying some of these or broaching these subjects as normalizing experiences that some people can have. And then the second piece is being comfortable talking to young people about their beat and saying, whenever these stresses come up, rather than approaching them with preconceived notions, being able to say, let's talk about how you felt in response to that moment, and then being able to hold space for that. So those are just a number of things, but those are some of the things that come to mind for educators.
Yes. And I feel like that is a great starting point for caregivers and educators, just in supporting teens and helping them, young people, build those internal resources, because you're coming from a place of understanding your own thoughts and biases, and also things that you don't know and that you may not be familiar with. And it's important to also recognize what you don't know, right?
That is true. And I would also add that I think sometimes this conversation starts with the stress, but I do love when parents and educators also start with the strength, right? Having ways in which young people can explore and celebrate their backgrounds, aside from just it being the stress. Like this school that I attended this past weekend had a culture fair where parents were organizing this event at the school where the students had tables related to their country of origin and could share about the foods and the customs and the traditions. So we're not just telling young people that their racial and cultural backgrounds are relevant only whenever somebody's treating them poorly, but that you can also celebrate these aspects of yourself in a day-to-day fashion and build senses of pride and love and all of that. So that's another way that parents and caregivers and educators can also think about this conversation, and using this book to help get ideas for how to help young people celebrate who they are and not just heal from the stresses associated with how others treat them.
Yes. And I think that is directly related to how we work with, neurodivergent students with learning and thinking differences. It's not always, where the struggle is, but also, embracing and highlighting those strengths because they're there, in the arts and in music and in sports. And, we talk about, values and the culture that also is a source of strength and support. And that also speaks to what you mentioned earlier, is like having individuals, young people know themselves, right? And you're not just the stressors that you face or that you experience, you're so much more. And by leaning into the strengths and having that strength-based approach is so important, because that helps to empower as well, which comes back to the empowered, we were talking about empowered coping.
Yes. No, I think that you're absolutely right. We can't just have a deficit or a stress-focused approach. We have to help. That's why in the title of the book, it's, heal, cope, and thrive. And thriving is a part of living beyond, the narratives associated with the stresses you face. But it's also helping you to think about the life that you want to live, the goals you want to pursue, and also embracing the strengths that you and your community have, and learning how to celebrate those. And that, I think, is something that we can all do proactively, and we don't have to wait until a young person tells us that they've been struggling to start those types of empowering conversations.
Absolutely. And I feel like there's a mindset shift when you move from how can I reduce my stress to how can I thrive?
Yes.
The approach is completely different in terms of how you see, navigating life.
Agreed so much.
Dr. DeLapp, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for writing this book and providing this amazing resource. If listeners want to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to connect with you?
So right now, I am at the Ross Center, which is a practice in the Washington, D.C. area and in New York. I am the creator and the director of the REACH program there, which offers a number of resources to young people, professionals, as well as organizations where I can give talks and trainings and so forth. So please check us out there. And if you have any inquiries related to what you heard today, feel free to contact us at reach@ross, ROSS, center.com. That's reach@rosscenter.com.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to put a link in the show notes to that website and also to your book. Thank you again. And thank you so much for all the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having this platform and for the work you're doing as well.
I hope you found today's conversation with Dr. DeLapp as powerful as I did. His approach reminds us that acknowledging pain is important, but so is nurturing resilience, agency, and joy in the face of that pain. If you want to go deeper, I highly recommend checking out his book, Empower Yourself Against Racial and Cultural Stress. I also want to remind our listeners that we're switching from a weekly to a twice monthly podcast schedule, with new episodes dropping on the first and third Tuesday of every month. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. As always, thank you for listening. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.